Well, first of all, I'd just like to say I'm very grateful for the opportunity to come and to respond to Professor Mouffe's presentation. As always, Professor Mouffe presents ideas in a super accessible and clear manner without simplifying, without removing complexity. And it is a feature not just of her presentations, but of her writing, this exquisite clarity and precision. And I really welcome that the presentation began by problematizing this term monoculture. And I think that there are a number of reasons why we might wish to problematize it. But I'm also interested in the appeal that certain images or figures of nature culture have, the figures of agriculture, the figure of culture, and certain kind of organicist type imaginaries that circulate. And I think that at times over the last 2 days there have been moments where there was a kind of an appeal to something like an authenticity or a guarantee in the world in terms of a rootedness to the world, so some kind of hope for nature culture. And I think that the term monoculture is interesting in as much as that it renews something in this strange and multiple heritage of this term culture. As Raymond Williams famously said, one of the most complicated terms in the English language, a problem that's not limited to the English language, but again, it's interesting to call to mind again the hegemony of English within the contemporary art system. One of the interesting propositions about culture that the American anthropologist Adam Cooper made in his 2000 book, Culture, was the proposition that it was a particular conceptual category that had achieved universal distribution globally. He opens his book by citing a Pacific Islander speaking to his community, saying, in the face of loss of our traditional ways of supporting ourselves, our traditional economy, what we have to do is capitalize on the fact that we have culture. We have culture difference, and that's something that we can monetize and thereby maintain our viability as a community. And I think Professor Mouffe, you very brilliantly problematized this kind of cosmopolitanism that pursues a kind of shopping, the supermarket shelf version of culture. One concern I have, though, is how easy it is or how hard it is for us to actually resist the draw of the language of culture towards this kind of supermarket version of cosmopolitanism. And what I'm thinking of here is, for example, the way in which we very quickly did a slippage from the term culture to the term art. And the sense in which art is somehow the kind of the metonymy of culture. Art can be it's the moment of the most exquisite realization of the idea of culture. And while that's not something that we absolutely explicitly promote, it is something in our habits of speaking that we move from the cultural in general to the art domain as the domain where culture is most exquisitely kind of resolved. And that also can be seen in the kind of the basic kind of political economy of the contemporary art system, where a particular version of the white cube, etc., has become a global standard. So what I'm trying to get at is that even within a discourse that seeks to resist the draw towards a universalizing, the draw towards a kind of positioning oneself as the hierarchical center, even in a discourse that seeks to resist that, it may not be possible to do that simply because of the fact of violence, the fact of a distribution of violence historically and the fact of a distribution of violence in the present, which is constitutive of a particular geopolitical imaginary, let us call it the West. So if in the West one proposes a humble, listening, we will go out, we will not presume we know, but we will listen. One is proposing that perhaps in the wake of 5, or as we say in Ireland, 8 centuries of colonial violence. Perhaps in the wake of centuries of colonial violence, it's not enough for us to decenter the European imaginary. And because part of the problem is the disavowal, even within a discourse of multiple modernities, the disavowal of the fundamentally constitutive moment of the colonial enterprise, so that one begins to understand capitalism not, as was pointed out earlier today, in the factories of Manchester, but rather in the cotton plantations of the Americas and in the slave trades of the Black Atlantic. That's where one begins the analysis. But that is something that perhaps we are seeing a rush in the contemporary art system to embrace this. The contemporary art system is willing to rush forward and embrace the notion of the decolonial. It's everywhere. It's pervasive within the discourse of the contemporary art field. But that rush and willingness to embrace it should perhaps give us pause to see, is it really possible in a generation or in a few years to really attend to a history of violence? And I'm firmly committed to this vision of an agonistic public sphere that Professor Mouffe, you have so brilliantly rehearsed and so exquisitely expressed within your writing, and how you have retuned it to the changing conjuncture. And I think it's particularly interesting the way in which you have reworked your thinking in the recent towards a left populism. So I'm basically sympathetic in pursuit of this project, but I have a note of caution, which is how does the particularity of the imaginary of the West, the imaginary of European modernity, and its fundamental dependence upon a 500 history of colonial violence, and at the same time its disavowal of what that means. How does the image today of the plantation and the question of the master's house on the plantation and whether the maroon will return to have a conversation with the master about how we might all get along. And I think that there is a caution needed in terms of the ease with which we imagine we can take account of a history of violence, partly because of the persistence of that violence which is disavowed, the persistence of that violence in the everyday texture of the world. So it's a question that I think more of the degree to which we are suspicious of this cosmopolitanism, and that even in the moments when we invoke pluralism, that we risk reenacting a certain fantasy that from the heart of Europe, one can make a map of the world. The fantasy that we can make a map of the world. And the fantasy that our particular mythopoesis in terms of culture, economy, society, ethics, aesthetics, that particular world building that has been done in Europe in all the varieties of its enlightenment, the fantasy that we are somehow able, even within that world, to imagine and understand and access the mythopoesis of other worlds. And I think this idea that was mooted earlier of listening to, I think there's something really tricky in the idea that we can actually listen to when part of what is not being avowed is the deeply structuring role of violence. So how does agonism operate in the wake of antagonism that's fully expressed itself and fully opened out. But again, I would emphasize that this is a caution or a moment of interrogation that is within a broad agreement with the analysis that has been so brilliantly rehearsed for us. But I would propose that maybe rather than inviting Professor Mouffe to respond immediately, that maybe it might be more useful to go to the audience for
yeah, I think that I would like to say something, because I agree very much with what you say, but I had the feeling that this is not really what the workshop was about, because I understood, but maybe wrongly, that basically what you were concerned is what the tendency toward, and that's what I found the term monoculture very bizarre, because and also some reference that was given in the text that circulated, reference to fascism, and I thought that what were really the question we were concerned was okay, there is, well, right-wing populism and defense of monoculture, and this, how are we going to be able to resist that? I mean, according to what everything you say, it's nothing much to do with that question, honestly. Maybe I got it wrong in terms of what was the aim of the seminar. But, so this is why, in fact, I was... I think many of the things that you say, by the way, I could use very much in order to enrich my critique of cosmopolitanism, So we are... but except that... how can I put it? The question is okay, we agree on the question of let's say, I would say the answer is not definitively criticizing, not people, no, you need to be cosmopolitan, you're not the perpetual, okay. What I wanted to say precisely is exactly that. We should not, it's not on the, we shouldn't look to cosmopolitanism in order to find a solution. But still, I mean, my question is that, and how are we going to envisage this way in which we and I think it's an important and it's a tricky question, because how can you, at the same time, recognize the importance of the diversity, the importance of some form of rootedness, the fact that you need some form of borders, in order to distinguish. They are different culture, and they permit us, and I like, for instance, that question, for me the concept of Levi-Strauss of écart differential is crucial, because it helps us to understand both the fact that they are different culture, but they are related, and there is something possible. What is possible, you can have antagonism, but you should also try to have agonism among them. But or put it more simply, how do you address then the question of monoculture? Because everything that you said, I agree very much with, but I don't see that you address the question of what will be the answer to monoculture. And it will be interesting to know if this question was, in a sense, addressed in the seminar, or if basically everybody went in another direction.
Would it not? So the idea of monoculture seems to propose that society can be an undifferentiated substance with a singular expression. So I would say that the idea of monoculture, as spelt out in the brochure, is not compatible with your way of describing the construction of society through an unending agonism, that there is no totalizing moment of the social. It's always subject to internal division, conflict. There is no end to the political. And so the social as the idea of the social as an undifferentiated substance with a singular culture is a non-starter.
Well, yes, of course. I agree with that. But then, honestly, I'm a bit confused, because I don't see that this was really, of course. Yeah. Let's say, I think that, but here we move to a different level, you know, which is more kind of political, I would even sociological thing. But how can we fight against this, you know, form of, but again, the idea of monoculture is precisely problematic, but take another way to address what I want to say. For instance, the way to fight against that is not simply by deconstructing, because what we have just been doing is deconstructing these. But look, for instance, I think that there are a lot of people who believe that and I'm not inventing that because I've been having discussion about it. The problem to fight racism is to teach people that race do not exist. You know, it's not science shows us that race do not exist, and I think it's a completely rationalist view because it's not simply by telling people, okay, telling them races do not exist, that they are going to stop being racist. You know, I think that this is something very, very different. Another example, which I like to quote, is a discussion I had several years ago with a Marxist sociologist in the US, who was convinced, just an example of the rationalism and the way in which politics is not about this question of, you know, rationalism. It was the problem with the American working class, the fact that they are not socialists, is because they don't know the Marxist theory of value. If they will know the Marxist theory of value, they will all realize that they are exploited and they will become all socialists. And the guy was very serious, very concerned, and he was organizing all over the US core classes in order to teach the Marxist theory of value to the workers. Convinced that, you know, so what, you see what I mean? It's not by giving theoretical reason that you change the consciousness of people. So this is not by deconstructing. I totally agree that, of course, you can do that, but it's not the way in which you are going to make a political argument.
There are questions.
Yeah.
In the meantime, I forgot my question. No, thank you very much for the interesting first lecture and your comments. I got to know your work, Professor Mouffe, 7 years ago in Strasbourg at the Council of Europe, where you were invited. And I find your the concept of the agonistic element very crucial, because, and also for the art world, because there will always be a war, a struggle for funding, for support, for audience. So it is, in a sense, a very useful concept to look at the cultural scene. But I have a few philosophical questions. I have been asking the monoculture, perhaps the term is not the best possible term, but I do think that one could give a definition of this term where we could understand what it means. It comes from the agricultural field and it entails a human action, toiling the soil. Now, a monoculture, an example of a monoculture, for example, in business, is the business schools, because that is a kind of an active framework put on the reality, and wherever you go to a business school, it's the same kind of thinking, it's the same formats that are projected on society. And that is a kind of exportation of a certain way of thinking about organizing work. In the cultural sector, to give an example, in the cultural sector, in my view, Magritte and Van Eyck and most of the exhibitions, and let's say most of the cultural field is actually monoculture, in the sense that it is not made in the first place for enjoyment or for aesthetic use, but is in function of making Brussels or the city attractive to Chinese and to other Europeans, to make pictures, to buy beer, and to consume and to add to the Belgian GDP. So my possible definition, I've asked myself after Professor Mouffe's remark that it's not the most lucky concept, I agree, but I was wondering, how could we use it? Well, in the sense that we produce a kind of culture and cultural products. Is it art? I don't know, but cultural products that serve another purpose than an aesthetic one and that have no pertinence and no relevance to the context. And with context, I understand economics, social situation, historical situation. So the socio-economic context. And that is what I would, how I would fix the unlucky choice of monoculture. Actually, I've talked too long and I didn't come up with a question. This is my apologies.
I think we have a question here.
Thank you very much, Professor Mouffe, for your wonderful lecture, and Mick, for your reaction. And it's maybe a remark also towards Mick. I think one of the problems is that we are maybe not ready to create a space of vulnerability, in a space where we are vulnerable. One of the recent, a recent gigantic cultural event was running under the motto, learning from the South. I thought that was really wrong because it presupposes a place that is entitled to learn from. So it was full of good intentions, but it went in that sense completely wrong. And I think it's very, very important to not fall in the trap of mapping further. But at the same time, we have to exploit this moment of museological doubt. Rethink the terms in art of research, acquisition, exhibition, etc. We need to rethink art's vocabulary, and it's also what I tried in another way to bring about in my lecture. We have to reinvent language, and we have to also kind of like work towards what Naeem Mohayamen, a Bengal artist, called joyous entanglements. Can they be joyous? But they have to be joyous. Yeah, it's kind of like a task. And another fantastic scholar, David Tay, formulated it really, really in a different way as an alternative to mapping. What would contemporary art look like? And this is out of a correspondence I had with him, so it's coming from him. If its diligent norms and pedagogical or representational habits were not those of the North Atlantic? What if its terminology was rooted in First Nation languages or in Austronesian ones instead of European? And I think that brings about another kind of way of not framing, but looking and joining instead of learning. I think that's something we might have missed at some point. Continuously working in the discourses that are made at our academia.
Maybe there are other questions for Professor Mouffe? Sorry.
Thank you very much for this lecture. I have a quite brief question, I think. I have an international relations background and working with discourses a bit, and I'm interested. You said that in order to arrive to a kind of pluralistic conceptualization of multiculturalism, we should embrace divergence in case of instead of difference, and acknowledge divergence without being antagonistic. But you also said that what we experience right now is a challenge of Western universalism. And I think this challenge is antagonistic. It's about revealing the contingency, the objectivity of Western thought, ideas, and about offering an alternative. And my question is basically, how do we get from this antagonistic challenging that we see within the West, but also from outside, to this kind of thought that is accepting of divergence, but not antagonistic, if I got you right.
But you know, this is the kind of question that absolutely no answer at an abstract level. How can you go from? You need to always to start from specific conjuncture. I mean, my work always start. I mean, for instance, I've always said repeatedly, I'm against what is called normative political theory. No, I think one need always to start from particular conjuncture, analyze them, and then from there try to see, which way you can go, what you can change, so it will always be starting from, I don't know, you can think, for instance, particular practices or a particular case, particular context, but not you go from antagonism to antagonism. This is really impossible to answer that question. But I want to say something for instance, what you say, sorry. Yeah, I think that what you said chimes with what I was saying, the example you gave from the artist, because precisely recognize the importance of the pluralize legitimate artistic practices and recognize that they are, ways in which, I don't remember the term that you, joyous and entanglement, is that the term you use? Yeah, I think I really like very much that term. But and this is why, for me, all that goes towards the question of pluralism, diversity, and learning a lot from other societies, other cultures, and trying to see, not believing that there is some kind of evolution, progression to, and that our modern art is superior to the art of the Iroquois. Or I think we've got to learn very much from recognize for instance, something also that Lévi-Strauss has been very strong is totally against the hierarchization of culture. He said that, and for instance, in his book La Pensée Sauvage, he revendicates precisely what is being considered by the West as savage thought. He said, no, that there's nothing. This thought is got, and his work on myths and symbols and things like that. There are different ways in which people express themselves, and we need to, in fact, today, is something that is through the discussion which is taking place about question of ecology and things like that. I mean, the resurgence of the, I don't speak of resurgence, but the popularity of some kind of called animism, and we are learning a lot of things and seeing, a lot of practices which are non-Western in a very different way, and not in judging them as no, but that is. I think that's very important. With respect to the first question, I think that you are a bit wrong concerning public, and this is anecdotal, but concerning business school. I've been invited to speak at many different business schools, and those are one of the most interesting places in terms of critical thought, I must say that it's true. The first time I went there, I said, why do they invite me, honestly? But then I was there, and I met, first, a lot of very interesting discussion among people who really have read their Derrida and Deleuze and all that, and want to discuss it. And by the way, that's funny. I once asked those people, because there you've got a lot of people who have made studies in comparative literature, and I was telling them, but why are you here in business school? They said, well, that's the only place where we could find a job, because those are the only department who got money. And so when we were looking for a job, we couldn't find. Then we were offered a job here and to teach, and then what we are doing is exactly teaching that. And I say, and what about the student? How do they take that? And say, well, that's a little of the problem, they say, because some of them can't like that, they find it awful. Other one love it so much that they abandon the business school after a few years and move to other careers. But, and of course, I'm not saying that all business schools are like that, but I think one should not have such a view, generalized business school like that, because I have been speaking in different business schools in different countries. And I mean, for instance, the Copenhagen Business School is really very special, and it's one of the best, employing a lot of very, very interesting people. So don't have such a prejudice with respect to business school.
So, one last opportunity. Well, maybe. Yeah, but maybe before Nav, Nick, and Nora take to the stage to just say closing words. Before they do that, if you could join me in thanking Professor Mouffe for her presentation this evening.